right.
Thank you, Sobaz. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. Morning. I'm going to just jump right in. Sobaz, if you can just stay for a second, because I am going to formally introduce you. I'd like to call Vanessa Fells up to sing the National Black Anthem, which you can find on the back of your flyer for today.
Look, I didn't even have to ask everybody to stand. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm so glad that they printed the words, because I'm singing the second verse, and I was like, I don't remember the second verse very well. Anyway. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as a rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the presence has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat had not our weary feet come to a place that which our Father sighed. We have come over a way with the tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out of our gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on our way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Thank you, Vanessa. So, Minister Ince, Christine Hansen, distinguished panel members, colleagues, welcome. First, I would like to acknowledge we are on the traditional Mi'kmaq lands of Mi'kmaq, the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And on behalf of African Nova Scotian Affairs and the Human Rights Commission, we thank you for joining us in person here. And I know we have a lot of folks who are tuning in online, so thank you for joining us today to recognize the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. My name is Tracy Thomas. I'm the Director of, Director of Government and Community Relations with African Nova Scotian Affairs. And so together with Dr. Kesa Monroe Anderson here with the Human Rights Commission, we're just honored to organize and host this day for you and to get the esteemed panelists that we have who are going to increase the dialogue that we're going to have on this very important topic. And the focus today being understanding anti-Black racism, trauma, and resilience. So I'm sure you all know that today is March 11th, not March 21st. And so we decided to move the day ahead, mainly because the discussion is really important, and March 21st falls on a Saturday, which is the tail end of March break, and it's also in the smack dab of the middle of the Canadian Black National Summit, which is happening on the 20th to the 22nd. And so we decided to move it up, and we're really pleased that we did, because the response has been tremendous. So, you know, the service announcement went out, the broadcast message went out at, I think, 6 o'clock in the morning. By 3 o'clock, we already had at capacity, which is why we decided to have the online or the streaming online option available. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. So now, before I call on Minister Ince and Christine Hansen, I just want to thank Sobaz Benjamin over there who did the drumming. And, you know, for those who experience the drumming, it's quite settling and it's quite uplifting. And you can almost see kind of how he can kind of maneuver the beat to kind of settle us down to get us ready to start. So I do want to thank you for that, Sobaz. So Sobaz is also an independent filmmaker, a writer, director, producer, and musician. So thank you again for that drumming. And then I want to thank the extraordinary Vanessa Fells, who in her day job is the program coordinator for the Decade for People of African Descent Coalition for singing the National Black Anthem. And she's also a crucial part of the organizing committee for the Canadian National Black Summit that's happening. So if you have any questions about the summit, you can see her. So those who are familiar with the National Black Anthem, typically when you attend events like this, we normally sing the first and last verse. But this year we decided to add in the second verse because it really resonates with the theme of what we're talking about today. The verse states, "Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way with the tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out of the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast." So those are very deep words, and you know, we could actually have a whole panel breaking down that whole verse, but that's not the topic of today. But I really wanted to state that because it really resonates with what we're talking about, which is really understanding anti-Black racism, trauma, and resilience. So now I will call on Minister Tony Ince, Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs, followed by Christine Hansen, Director and CEO of the Human Rights Commission, to bring remarks.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for having this and welcoming me. This is really needed. We really need to have these difficult conversations. On March 21st, we are joining the international community to stand against systemic racism and discrimination, which unfortunately is still a reality for many people. Today's panel will help us to understand these issues through dialogue and discussions, so together we can learn and thereby challenge racist behaviors. Even though March 21st is the official International Day for the elimination of racial discrimination, we must continue to address the issues of race every day. We must be willing to have difficult conversations every day. And we must recognize the negative impacts that racism causes in our society every day. I, along with many people in this room, have experienced the harsh effects of discrimination and racism. I chose a career in politics as another path towards trying to correct that. It wasn't politics that drove me to this, because I've been fighting this long before politics. But I felt I need to be at the table where my voice could be heard in a more powerful place than on the streets. I also have a passion for encouraging and welcoming a more diverse workplace in public and private sectors. I'm proud to say that the Public Service Commission is committed to creating healthy, safe, and supportive workplaces where all individuals are treated with dignity and respect. We have a responsibility to reflect, celebrate, and leverage the tremendous diversity that Nova Scotia offers. We must lead by example as we create an environment where we all will feel welcome and we can all feel we can bring ourselves to our workplaces. Diversity and inclusion at every level of the public service brings a range of perspectives which fuels innovation and progress. It contributes to increased employee engagement and productivity, which helps attract and retain many skilled and dynamic public servants. That's why yesterday, March 10th, we launched our Public Service Commission's second Diversity and Inclusion Strategy. The strategy, entitled All Together, an action plan for diversity and inclusion in the Public Service Commission, is focused on making sure our senior leadership is held accountable to increase diversity, to develop our current and future leaders. And our senior leadership will be responsible to identify the barriers and solutions to those barriers, and we will measure our progress. As part of this strategy, each department is setting their own tangible goals to move us forward through action and accountability. The work is already alive and in action. Our diversity and inclusion senior consultants are working with senior leadership teams in all departments to explain the new strategy, set goals, and create action plans. And will not stop there. Folks, thank you all for coming out. I look around the room, I see a great combination of what Nova Scotia, a microcosm of what Nova Scotia is. Let's begin today by having those uncomfortable conversations. And for those who may feel uncomfortable, please take a moment, reach out, talk to your partner. Let that partner know you feel uncomfortable. Because I can tell you, those of us who've experienced those uncomfortable feelings ourselves have always been welcoming and ready to share and discuss with you what we really see as an issue. And I'll leave you with this one little thing. When I was campaigning in 2012, I was knocking at a door of an educator. The educator was excited because she said, we can have a conversation. But she was struggling with a word, how to say something to me. I stood there for a couple of moments, waiting for her to find her word. She couldn't find the word. I looked at her and I said, you know what, that's okay. I said, this is the problem. Just say it. I'll know by your tone, your intent, whether you meant it in a derogatory term, but just say it, because now I can tell and explain to you my feelings, my reaction to what you're saying. Just say it, folks. Just have the conversation. Just say it. We will correct you. And we will be open and have those good conversations with you. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Minister Ince, and good morning. Welcome, everyone. This is a venue of choice for the Human Rights Commission. I suspect at some point they're going to keep telling us not to keep coming back over and over again. I'm so pleased to be here today. The response from public servants, as Tracy mentioned, was really overwhelming. We were a bit taken aback, but in a good way. This is a good problem to have, that so many people wanted to participate in this event. So we scrambled, and I want to thank the people that are tuning in through live stream this morning. It's really important that we have a conversation like this one. I hope that all of you will take what you hear today and reflect upon it, and it can inform the work that you do as public servants. I especially want to thank Tracy and Kesa and their teams for all the work in organizing this event, and our panelists for agreeing to come here today and to share their experience and their expertise with us. The Human Rights Commission is committed to broadening the discussion around all forms of discrimination, in particular racism experienced by Black and African Nova Scotians. Incidents of anti-Black racism in Nova Scotia are not a new phenomena. As we all know, for generations, the systems and institutions that exist to advance our society have brought deep harm and trauma to African Nova Scotians. I can say this is not a history discussion. Over the past year, the Commission has seen a surge in race-based complaints. This actually just increased last year from 13% to 23% of our complaints. So this is an important discussion that we're having here today, and still very, very relevant. We will recognize United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on the 21st. I'm glad that we're having this discussion early, and I strongly encourage those of you that are able to participate in the National Black Summit this upcoming weekend to do so. My own spring break plans have been completely turned on their head this week. I'm scrambling to cancel flights, but one of the silver linings of that is I will be able to participate in the National Black Summit, because that was something I had been disappointed not to do. So please, I strongly encourage you to participate if you can. I just want to take the moment today. It's really incumbent on us to take what we hear, to see opportunities to better understand how our actions, affect the lives of our colleagues, our friends, our community. And so I just want to thank you again for coming, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Christine. So before I introduce the moderator who's going to begin the discussion, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. So those who don't know, the washroom is, if you go out the hall past the registration desk, you make a left. It's down there. I think there is a gender-neutral washroom there as well. If, in case there is a fire, heaven forbid, there is not, our muster point will be across the street past the construction of the New Horizons Church right there on Maitland Street, I think it is. So now I would like to share a little background on the importance of today. So on March 21st, 1960, 60 years ago, state police in South Africa opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against apartheid passbook laws in Sharpeville, South Africa. Now, passbook laws were an internal passport system designed to control the movement of Black people, where they had to carry identifying documents with them at all times. This restrictive law was a dominant feature in South Africa's apartheid system up until 1986. And of course, this is a form of anti-Black racism, which is why we're here today to actually have this conversation. So the day, March 21st, commemorates the lives lost to the fight for democracy and human rights in South Africa during the apartheid regime. By proclaiming the day in 1966, the United Nations Assembly called on the international community to increase its efforts to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination. So now fast forward to today, we are entering into the 6th year of the UN's Decade for People of African Descent, and the decade runs from 2015 to 2024. And it provides a framework to fight racism, discrimination, and the ongoing inequalities faced by people of African descent under the 3 pillars: justice, recognition, and development. And for those who don't know, Nova Scotia is one of the few jurisdictions to develop and launch an action plan called Count Us In response to the International Decade. You'll see the pull-up banner there. We do have some copies outside for you to take with you, or those who are tuning in online, you can actually find it on the ANSA website. So the Count Us In focuses on 3 pillars of the decade: recognition, justice, and development, and is a tool that will help address systemic and racism, discrimination, to create a province where African Nova Scotians have equitable access to opportunities our province has to offer. If you don't have a copy, of course, there are some there. So now that I've done a little shameless plug, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Kesa Monroe Anderson. Kesa is a zealous, community-oriented individual who practices an Afrocentric approach to leadership, living out her philosophy that leadership and lifelong learning go hand in hand. Kesa attained a Bachelor of Arts degree in English with honors and a Master of Arts degree in English from Acadia University, as well as a Master's of Education in Lifelong Learning with a focus in Afrocentric leadership at Mount St. Vincent University, graduating in 2008 as a valedictorian. In May 2018, Kesa was the first person of African descent to graduate from the Inter-University Doctor of Educational Studies program with Mount St. Vincent University, being her degree-granting institution. Her doctoral dissertation explored the role of spirituality in an anti-oppressive agent in the formal education of African Nova Scotian learners. Kesa is currently the Director of Race Relations and Equity Inclusion with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. Welcome, Kesa.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Special welcome to our panelists, whom I will introduce in a moment. But I would like to take this opportunity to also acknowledge that we are in Nova Scotia, and Nova Scotia is the birthplace of African presence in this country. And we've been in existence as African people for over 400 years in this province, and we should be very proud of that fact. And so we should feel enriched by our discussion today, but I encourage you to also reflect on our discussion today. And Minister Ince, before he had to leave us, gave us permission to just say it. Tell your neighbor, just say it. All right, don't be shy. We're here today to have courageous conversations. From Africville to Shelburne, Lincolnville to Whitney Pear, African Nova Scotian youth feeling isolated and forgotten in Digby and Yarmouth. We are North Preston fighting against negative stigma, East Preston and Cherry Brook, Upper Hammonds Plains fighting for our own water, Beachville resisting the shrinking of their community, Lucasville insisting on the legacy of their name, from Kirk Johnson to Andrella David, Trayvon Clayton and his fellow youth simply wanting to visit Parliament Hill, and African Nova Scotians across this province insisting on the illegality of street checks. And we could name so many more injustices we have recently seen in the media and unfortunately in places where many of us frequent. So we are here indeed to have a courageous conversation. Today's panel discussion will raise awareness on how anti-Black racism is defined and its distinct differences from general definitions of racism. The panelists will provide insight into the effects of anti-Black racism on people of African descent, as well as necessary ways of coping employed by people of African descent, and how even this detracts from our energies and attention to everyday life duties and activities. We intend that this discussion will provide an opportunity for all to learn how to engage in self-reflection and self-awareness, about our individual actions and behaviors, the values and beliefs of others, and to be aware of and address systemic issues which negatively impact upon people of African descent specifically. So let's welcome our panelists. First, to my direct right is Winnie Grant. Winnie Grant is the mother of two beautiful African Nova Scotian women, Kayasia and Castiva Benton, and the grandmother to Jarrell Jr., JJ. She is married to her partner, George Grant, and currently works as both the Senior Advisor of African Nova Scotian Issues with the Department of Community Services and as an adjunct professor at Dalhousie School of Social Work. Winnie attained her Bachelor and Master of Social Work degrees at Dalhousie University. She attained her Master of Social Work thesis is entitled The Evolution of African Consciousness, the Effects of Racism on Africans in the Diaspora. Winnie also completed a Master of Education in Lifelong Learning with an Afrocentric focus on policy development at Mount St. Vincent University. She is a licensed social worker with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers and an active member of the Association of Black Social Workers, where she is the membership chair. Winnie mentors several social workers seeking licensure and is a director on the national board of Big Brothers, Big Sisters, as well as being a mentor in this program. She works hard at employing an Afrocentric theoretical perspective and critical race analysis in everything she does, in her full-time employment, her teaching assignments, and when reflecting on her lived experiences. Please help me welcome Ms. Winnie Benton. Beside Winnie is Otis Day. Otis Day has been in the field of education for over 13 years. He holds an interdisciplinary bachelor's degree in peace and conflict from Mount St. Vincent University, a bachelor's degree in education, and a master's in leadership and administration with a focus on mental health, both from St. Francis Xavier University. Starting off as a classroom support, Otis then shifted to help pilot the Schools Plus program before finally landing in the classroom as an elementary teacher. Otis is now the student equity consultant for Halifax Regional Center for Education, where he is dedicated to helping students, teachers, and administrators understand the role that culture, race, and human rights play in creating a positive and supportive school culture. Otis continues to advocate on behalf of students who have traditionally been disengaged in school and is passionate about finding new and creative ways to allow students to reach their full potential. Otis is supported by family that includes his wife and 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Otis Day. And finally, Stacy DeLamini. Stacy DeLamini was born and raised in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, and attended Acadia University, where she graduated with a degree in political science. While at Acadia, she had the opportunity to travel to South Africa, where she met the person who would later become her husband. Upon graduation, Stacy moved to South Africa and became engaged professionally in youth work and community development, and also married her person. They soon became parents through adoption to Bijou, then a teenager who hailed originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and NH, the younger brother of Stacy's husband. They later added 2 biological children to the mix, Trinity, now 14, and Kaya, age 8. Stacy lived in South Africa for 13 years before returning 6 years ago to Nova Scotia with her family. NH was the victim of a nail gun shooting in 2018 at his workplace, in a widely publicized incident which his family maintains was racially motivated. The individual was convicted of criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm and assault with a weapon. Stacy's understanding about the reality and the impact of anti-Black racism was greatly influenced by the close relationships she has developed through the years with people who hail from the African Nova Scotian community, the Caribbean, and across the African continent. By her own admission, she is still learning and growing in this understanding. But as a parent, a wife, a friend, and someone who has journeyed closely with people of color for over a generation, she feels she has some insights to offer on the things her life experiences have taught her. Let's welcome Stacy DeLamini. So we will invite panelists in the order in which I introduced you to come to the podium and present to us for 8 to 10 minutes. Following that time, I will start us off with one question, then open up the floor to questions. There is a mic that will be floating. I don't see, where's the mic? Okay, in the back there, thank you. There's a mic that will be floating, and we will walk around and take your questions. And I don't know if all of you brought anything to write with. You have your phones probably. If you want to jot down notes, we do have some notepads and extra pens. If anybody needs a notepad, just let us know. I'll be looking around, okay? But thank you very much, and welcome, Ms. Winnie Grant.
Good morning, everyone. So 8 to 10 minutes to talk about understanding racism and the impact that it has. So I want to start by saying I hope I'm not talking to the converted, and if I am, I'm hoping that you're going to take this information back and talk to somebody else who's not converted. I also wanted to start today with a video, but because of the size, that wasn't possible. So I'm going to explain what the video was, and maybe some of you may have seen the video. So the video is with Jane Elliott, and it's a 1-minute video where she is speaking to a white audience. And she says to the audience, if you are willing to trade places with someone of African descent, please stand. And nobody stands. And then she says, oh, maybe you didn't hear me. And so she repeats the question, and nobody stands. And she says, nobody stood because that tells me that you know how bad black people are being treated. You don't want it for yourselves, so why is it okay to treat black people in the manner in which we do? So I say that to help us to springboard into the discussion today. So when we talk about racism, one of the things that I realized over my many years of doing anti-racist work, and I'm going to date myself to say probably my oldest is 25, and I remember being pregnant with her doing it, so at least 25 years ago. What I've realized is that many folks don't understand racism. They confuse it with prejudice, they confuse it with discrimination, and so just to set the context, I want to be able to do that. Usually, I will have folks engage in the discussion, but for the interest of time, and please let me know when my time is up, I'm sure you will. So when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about a preconceived thought, okay? And everyone can be prejudiced. Everyone can hold a preconceived thought. Discrimination is the action that's related to that preconceived thought, and again, everyone can discriminate. And so as Kesa talked about, we've been here as people of African descent for over 400 years, and stereotypes are still existing for folks of African descent for over 400 years. And so why is that? And we know that some of those stereotypes, the characteristics of those stereotypes are the same characteristics that can be found in any ethnic population. But if I was to ask you to identify stereotypes related to persons of African descent, you would specifically say things like lazy, drug dealers, prostitutes, not able to be educated or have a low education, have lots of children, have absent fathers, loud, violent, and the list goes on and on and on and on. I say that because when I was doing my bachelor's of social work, I did my placement with the Association of Black Social Workers, where I supported students in grade 2. And when I supported them, a young man, we met with the group at lunchtime, and a young boy, actually at the time, had said to me, we were talking about his experience of racism, and he said, they treat us differently as black students. We got in a fight because of an incident of racism. The white child called me the N-word, but why do I get penalized and be sent home from school and the other person not? And then they shared incidents of racism, and one of the ones that stood with me was he had talked about, and this school has a very narrow hallway, and he talked about how they were trying to be respectful to the teachers when the teachers went down the hall. And so 3 of them stood beside the lockers to give space for the teacher to go by. And the teacher's response, instead of saying thank you, was, oh, what are you boys doing, getting ready for a police lineup? So just imagine, in grade 2, this is the comment that was made. Now this child is expected to go into the classroom to learn, just like any other student. And so when we talk about the impact of racism, those are the impacts. And for children at that age, oftentimes they don't have the literacy to explain the emotions. And so what happens? They either don't listen in school or they act out in class because they're having difficulty regulating their emotions. And so that experience actually is what was the catalyst for my master's thesis in 1997. Again, 97. Still relevant today. And that's a real problem. When we're looking at, always celebrating the elimination of racism, and so what are we doing? And the reason I want to show that video is because we all have a responsibility. We know this young boy who had talked to me knew the impact of racism. He knew how it felt, he knew how it hurt, but still nobody does anything about it. So when we talk about racism, my definition of racism is that it's the oppression of a race of people. And it's not, as I talked earlier, that prejudice and discrimination, we all can be prejudiced and we all can discriminate. But as a person of African descent, I cannot be racist. And so what happens, that becomes a little difficult for persons of African descent to understand, because then they get caught up in their guilt, they get caught up in, it's my ancestors, it wasn't me, like I'm a really nice person. But if you benefit from your ancestors' privileges, then you're taking part if you're not speaking up about the injustices that happen. And so much of what we know is that there are injustices. We witness it all the time. Some of us recognize it, some of us don't recognize it. And that's even for persons of African descent. And so the reason I wanted to show that video is because I wanted to remind persons of African descent that our lived history is traumatic. And so when we talk about resilience and we talk about trauma, we are traumatized every day that we experience an incident of racism. And we have to consciously be mindful in terms of how are we going to go about to start our day, to maintain a sense of good health. And so when we talk about the psychological impact of racism, we talk about anger, we talk about the isolation, we talk about conforming, we talk about different ways that we even talk when we're with different people. Right? We talk about having suicidal thoughts. We talk about not wanting to show up and not knowing why we don't want to show up. We talk about, when we're talking about that psychological impact, we're talking about not just acting out, but abusing whether substance or people in order just to get through a day. And so we, as persons of African descent, have to learn healthy coping mechanisms in order to become healthy and to stay healthy and to share that with others. Have those tough conversations, as was talked about. And, when we talk about having those tough conversations, sometimes it's even tougher for us. And so it's important for people who do not look like us to know that when we're having those conversations, sometimes we have to have them, because I know I would say to folks, if I don't have that conversation, my head's going to blow. But I also know that there's times that I need to choose my battles, right? And I also know that, if I don't get it today, it will be tomorrow or the next day or the day after. So, but we do have a responsibility if we're looking at eliminating racism, not just for our current generation, but the generations to come. And we have, for the longest time, have just survived through these systems. I think about my mother. I think about my mother working, working, and again, I'm a young child, not knowing when my mother, how hard she worked, and the things that she would have to endure because she needed that job to provide for her children. But do you think that anybody would take that into consideration in terms of recognizing that as a single parent of 7 children, that she would have to put up with the discrimination and the racism and not have any place to deal with that? We now have systems in place to be able to deal with that, but many of us don't feel safe enough to go forward to address those. And so, in my current role with the Department of Community Services, You know, I'm really proud to be able to serve as the senior advisor. I'm really proud of the African Nova Scotia staff who have come forward to share their concerns about racism and participated in a healing session to try to make some changes within the Department of Community Services. I'm really proud of my executive team that currently are working collaboratively together to make our space a safer space to work. And that's something that is that needs to happen, not just in the Department of Community Services, but needs to happen in all spaces. People need to feel comfortable enough to speak up about the issues that they're not just witnessing. I see you with papers. I was just okay. I thought you were giving me the flag. So when we think about trauma and when we think about our resilience, you know, they go hand in hand because we have been here for over 400 years. And the trauma that we experience on a daily basis, we cannot minimize those experiences. We need to be able to lift and support each other. We need to be able to have those tough conversations where we say to our colleagues, this was a challenge for me. We need to be able to mentor people, to be able to be allies, to speak up with you and in those rooms where conversations are and you're the only person of African descent. It is important that we have people who support us, but not just in saying, oh, you did really good. No, no, no. I need you to do better because they will listen to you. When I have those conversations, I'm either labeled as intimidating, aggressive, too sensitive, and those are the pieces that impacts our mental health, right? So I say that to say that racism is traumatic. When we talk about trauma, you know, in terms of a definition of trauma, we're talking about an incident that we have no control over. I have no control over incidents of racism. As much as I may want to put coping mechanisms in place, you know, I often will describe incidents of racism like a paper cut. Did anyone ever have like a paper cut kind of right here? And so you're conscious of it, so you hold your hand together because you want this cut to heal. But all of a sudden, there's that donut or that apple or whatever it is that you're excited about, and you just grab it and you're no longer conscious of that paper cup, and therefore it just happens again. And so for us as people of African descent experiencing racism, you know, we don't wake up every day saying, now who am I going to jack up today? Because I know somebody is, you know. I want to be able to wake up and have a meaningful day, right? I want to be able to go to work, put my best foot forward, put a smile on my face, and keep that smile on my face. But in coming to work, then I need to prepare myself emotionally for those tough conversations. I need to prepare myself emotionally for the incidents of racism that I may have at a Lawton's, on the street, at a McDonald's, and then come to work and show up. So I say that to say I will encourage questions, and my time is up. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is really nice to be here, as always. It's anytime I have an opportunity to come out to the Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute, it's always an honor and a pleasure, especially since it bears my grandfather's name, so I am always appreciative of that fact, and I also make note, and I always want to acknowledge that fact as well. So my name again is Otis Day. I'm the Student Equity Consultant with HRCE. I'm going to explain a little bit about what the role of the Student Equity Consultant is and how it's kind of transformed over the last year or so. Originally, the Student Equity Consultant position was actually named RCH Consultant, or Race Relations, Cross-Cultural Understanding, and Human Rights Consultancy. Just this year that has changed because part of my responsibilities also included within race and culture extends to gender, sexuality, trans rights, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and beyond. So part of what I have to do is make sure that I'm able to have some of these difficult conversations that we've mentioned and that we've talked about, but I have to be able to have it in lots of different areas, within lots of different forms, and with lots of different people. A good portion of the work that I do it centers around work with students. And so oftentimes what's happened is there'll be a particular incident at a school where there might be an incident of racism or discrimination or any of the other forms that I've just mentioned. And then I go out. I deliver workshops with the students. And those workshops really are centered around and grounded by issues of race. And we start with race because we understand that race is really we use it almost as a lens to get to other forms of prejudice and discrimination because essentially they all work in the same way. When we explore race, though, I ask students a very simple question. I lay the chart papers out, I give them also markers, and I simply ask them to define what is race. And all of the responses that I've gotten have been quite similar, but also very telling. Oftentimes, there's a lot of confusion around race. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of just a general lack of knowledge as it pertains to race, which leads into some of this anti-Black racism, which we're talking about this morning. A lot of it is born out of ignorance. A lot of it is born out of a lack of knowledge. And a lot of it is born out of just general confusion around what is and what isn't as it relates to race. When I was working with the students, I start this particular workshop that I do it with junior highs up to high school students. And so I would go through and I'd ask the question, what is race? I'd have the students kind of define it, and they would come back. Sometimes they have things, they would mention things around culture or nationality. But what I noticed is that it's a lot easier for the students to talk about race because they don't have the same hang-ups that we as the adults do. It is a lot easier for students to just say it, partially because they don't have the language, partially because they don't have the background knowledge, and also they're a lot less inhibited by the fact that race in our society is always seen as race and racism. As if these two things, they come together as if there's no way that they could exist mutually exclusive of one another. They have to exist together, race and racism. So students come to a point where they just say, color of your skin, right? And I accept that. I actually think that is a good way of kind of looking at it. The idea about race, we have to understand that it is socially constructed. It is purely something that is based on simply the color of a person's skin. And then the idea of racism is the idea that one group of people is actually better than the other. And when I break it down with that and I kind of just help and allow students to kind of wrestle with these ideas that there are certain things that we've put into a place that we've decided and we've kind of categorized people in the exact same way that we've categorized things like plants and animals and insects, right? It starts to seem as if this is a really kind of strange concept for them to wrestle with. But it really does allow them to kind of move forward in their understanding and their contemplations as they start to think about race. When I was doing that with the students, however, what I noticed is that the teachers could use the exact same work. And so I started delivering these same workshops with the teachers. And then, of course, the same thing started to come up. And so there's a couple of trends that I began to notice. And really what was happening is that we as a society, what tends to happen is we stop thinking about race at a particular point. The concepts, the ideas, their understanding around race, really for a high school student, grade 10, even grade 9, is the exact same as what I would get with some teachers and administrators. And that tells me that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. One of the major issues that I've been seeing over the last, let's say probably about a year or so, is a rise in an issue that is obviously quite troubling for the folks in this room, but really it should be troubling for everybody. And that's the rise of the use of the N-word. Now, I have to kind of break this down and categorize it into two little sections because there's a lot of history, of course, as you all know, that goes into this word. But there's two things that are happening. One is that there's a lot of use among students using the N-word. They use it in lots of different forms. Sometimes it's used as a derogatory term. Sometimes it's also used as a term of endearment. Sometimes it's actually used as a way to build social capital amongst peers. And then an even more disturbing trend is that what we're seeing is that there are African Nova Scotian students or Black students who are actually given what's known now as the N-word pass, where if you have a relationship with a particular Black student, male or female, doesn't matter, and they happen to be a white student, what they're getting is a pass to use this language in the schools. And of course this is problematic, right? It doesn't stop there, though, because what another trend that has also become quite apparent is that when you start having this kind of loose, flippant use of the word, it extends beyond the students, and we've actually even had some incidents where teachers are using it within the context of the classrooms as well. I do have to be a little bit careful in saying that because often it's within the context of literature, it's within the context of movies or media or music or whichever it is. But either way, though, the damage is the exact same, right? Because what ends up happening is because of this kind of confusion, this lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding around the term, the terminology, how it's used, where it comes from, the origins of the word, what happens is it devalues the experience of Black Nova Scotians. Right? Because there are so many people who are still trying to wrestle with and understand where these terms come from, the impact of them, and because of its use in all kinds of different forms, media, music, movies, and lots of other places, literature as well, it often becomes very, very confusing for the students. I can give you an example. There was one student that I was working with who didn't have a very good or strong peer group. He was kind of isolated in his community. He didn't go out very much when he was home. He was kind of labeled within his community, and a lot of folks kind of turned their back on him and didn't work with him as much as they probably should have. For him, his social capital was all online. So everything that he was doing was online, video games, computers, that area there. The language that was used on these kind of platforms, online video games, whatever, was racial. And for him, this particular student, his understanding of how to make friends, how to be accepted, came directly out of the use of the N-word. And so, of course, what happens is that he goes into a school, he walks into his classroom, and he says, "Hey, what's up?" And that's a problem. Okay? Now, it's a problem for two reasons. One, obviously, because we can't have language like that within our schools. There are rules around this. We have a code of conduct that says that we're certainly not able to use racial language within the classrooms or within the context of the schools. But the broader problem is really that the student didn't understand where the word had come from, what the word was used for originally, and why it even exists so much in a platform that he's used to and that he's accustomed to using. And so a part of what I have to do when I go in and I'm working with students, and again, when I'm working with teachers, is first get them to the point where we've all said this morning, is to just say it. We have to be able to break down the barriers to allow people to expose their own vulnerabilities, expose the things that they're not quite sure of, because that's the only way that we're able to move things forward. If I was to come into a room and I start working on a presentation, I'm doing workshops with teachers and students, and everybody's afraid to say exactly what they're saying, then there is absolutely no movement going to happen in that room. I have to get them to a point where first they feel comfortable enough to talk about what they're thinking, to talk about some of the things that they've heard, be it at home, in their own communities, around their own dinner tables, to talk about what exactly it is that they're hearing and that they're saying and that they're seeing and they're experiencing, because then we can begin to unpack some of these things. And if we're not able to unpack it, then it remains stagnant. It stays in this kind of box or an envelope, and nobody is really able to really dissect and think about and be critical when they start to look at issues around race, around the language that we use, around why we use it, and then around the responses that we give to the language that's used. One of the activities that I do actually deals directly with stereotypes. So it's great that you mentioned it. And the stereotype activity is an interesting one because basically what I ask both teachers and students and administrators to do is I just give them a cue card and I say, could you just put down any stereotype that you have heard? Not the stereotypes that you live your life by, not the stereotypes that you use as your guiding principles for how you engage with others, but just simply the stereotypes that you have heard. I ask them not to put their names on it, again, allowing for that space for vulnerability. And I get the stereotypes back. When I read them out, I would say 70 to 80% are stereotypes as they relate to African Nova Scotians or to Black youth. Always. Doesn't matter the community that I'm in or the school that I'm working at or the group, but they always relate to those types of stereotypes. The follow-up to that, however, though, is that I take cards from other schools. I take cards from teachers, from administrators, from other students, both younger and older, and I read them out. And always, every single time, what we notice is that the stereotypes are the exact same. It's the same if I did it with students in grade 3. It's the same if I do it with students in grade 12. It's the same if I do it with administrators with master's degrees and degrees in education who've been in the field. They're always the same. The response is also the same. I get a lot of laughter. A lot of people just thinking that it's funny. It's this kind of, this is a really easy thing to kind of go through. They're very harmful. But the biggest takeaway that I have to impress upon each other is that the response that we give when we hear things, the ability to stand up and say, you know what, that's not funny. I'm not gonna deal with that. That's not gonna work for me. That's the way that we begin to change the culture. What we need to do is we need to embolden our youth. We need to empower them. And our teachers as well, to feel comfortable enough to when you hear and when you see instances of racism, discrimination, sexism, homophobia, whichever it is, but when you see and you hear these incidents, you have to be able to stand up and to say, hold on a second, that's not funny. And once we're able to do that, then we can begin to change the culture, we can begin to change our communities, and we can again begin to change our schools. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I have notes because I don't want anyone to miss their lunch today. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the Department of African Nova Scotian Affairs, to the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and to the Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute for hosting this conversation. I think that there's far too few spaces and opportunities in this province where we as Nova Scotians can come together and explore issues around race. And we need more honest and courageous conversations. But most importantly, we need for these conversations to flow into real change. What happened to my son should not have happened. For the first 3 weeks of his employment at PQ Properties, Tlantla Dlamini, then age 21, experienced numerous episodes of race-based bullying. This activity escalated until September the 18th, 2018, when there was an exchange of words between Tlantla and Sean Wade Heinz, a senior carpenter on site. And for a moment, they locked eyes. Tlantla saw Sean lift the nail gun and aim it in his direction. He saw Sean pull back the safety mechanism, and he knew that he was in danger, so he ran. Seconds later, a 3.5-inch nail pierced his back, and he collapsed on the ground. Sean came over to him where he was writhing in pain and pulled the nail out, and that nail was never recovered. The crew gathered around him and administered first aid of sorts. They looked for the puncture wound, they cleaned it with antiseptic, they put a Band-Aid on it. They asked him if he wanted to go to the hospital. Tlantla said no, he wanted to go home and lie down. So his boss drove him home to the house that he shares with his friend and left him in the driveway. No ambulance was called, no accident was reported. It took almost 2 hours for Tlantla to get any medical attention. He didn't know that the nail had pierced his lung. And with each breath, air was escaping from the lung and filling the cavity between the lining in his chest wall, forcing his lung to collapse. And by the time emergency surgery was performed, his lung had collapsed by 25%. He would be in the hospital for 4 days. On September 26, 2019, Judge Del Atwood found Sean Heinz guilty on both charges of criminal negligence, resulting in bodily harm, and assault with a weapon. Now that verdict meant that the court accepted that this was an act committed with intention. It was not an accident. It bears mention that the issue of race was never brought up at the trial, as the Crown did not believe he could prove it as a motivating factor beyond a reasonable doubt. The Crown was worried that this might complicate the trial or jeopardize a guilty verdict. This was a strategic decision on his part, but we as a family have never shied away from publicly stating that we believe racism, anti-Black racism, played a major role in our son's treatment at his workplace and in his subsequent assault. The man who shot my son remains employed by Paul Quinn at Paul Quinn Properties to this day. His employer not only retained him as a senior carpenter, but also submitted a character reference to the court on Sean's behalf, stating that he was a good worker and an all-round good guy. As Tlantla's mother, that's a tough thing for me to deal with. Sean Heinz's sentencing will be pronounced next week, concluding a year and a half of court proceedings. Now, I've been asked to address the topic, what can we as white people do to be more self-aware of our own actions, behaviors, power, and privilege in addressing and stopping anti-Black racism? And I was given 8 minutes. Now, in the aftermath of my son's injury, white people, many white people in my community came to me privately to ask after Ntlanta's well-being and to express their shock that such a thing could still happen here. And to be honest, I could feel their genuineness. They were truly sorry for what my family was going through. What I realized after many of these conversations was that often the person I was talking to would try and distance themselves from such behavior. They would more often than not say things like, "As for me, I don't see color." Now here's the problem with that though. Angela Davis said, in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. It's not enough to not be that person who shoots my son with a nail gun. It's not enough to not be that person that throws around the N-word. If we really want things to change in Nova Scotia, then we, as white people, need to be intentional about not tolerating racist attitudes and behaviors around us. We need to be intentional about fixing the systems that still to this day disadvantage Black people in this province. So what I'm going to say now is not meant for the likes of the man who shot my son. Such people need a Damascus Road experience, and I am not Jesus. I'm talking to you well-meaning, well-intentioned white people who don't want to be part of the problem, but you're not yet sure how quite to be part of the solution either. So what can we do? And I have 3 simple points for you to consider. Firstly, we have to accept that white privilege is a real thing. Now, when we as white people hear the term white privilege, you can almost see us squirming around in our seats, or rolling our eyes, or shrinking just a little, because most of us don't really accept the reality that we have advantages based on the color of our skin that other people do not. Now, in my family, my aunts and uncles positively balk at the idea that their skin color afforded them any advantages in life. Because my family, on my father's side, grew up miserably poor. They lived literally in a tar paper shack in the woods close to where the 3 rivers empty into Pictou Harbor. My grandmother was a domestic worker or a factory worker at other times, and a single mom to 9 children. Theirs was an exceedingly difficult childhood. And yet members of my family worked hard to overcome this. Without exception, they have improved their lives for themselves and their children, and I'm a beneficiary of their tenacity and perseverance. White privilege doesn't mean that there was no adversity for you to overcome. It just means that your race did not create more adversity for you to have to overcome. My own white privilege became apparent to me one day in Sobeys in Pictou, on that day at the end of summer, when watermelons went on sale. Watermelons usually cost $7, but on this day they were 99 cents. And I started thinking about all the people in my life that would benefit from a watermelon. And I came up with a list of 8 people that I wanted to buy watermelons for. Trouble was, I already had a trolley full of groceries, and 8 watermelons would crush my groceries. So I went to the cashier, and I paid for my groceries, and I said to her, "Can you please add 8 watermelons to that receipt?" And she said, "Sure." So she rung them up. I got 1 receipt. I stuffed it in my pocket. I took my trolley outside and unloaded my groceries in my car. Then I took my trolley back inside, now empty, stood in front of the watermelon display, loaded up 8 watermelons into my trolley, and without passing by the cashier, headed straight for the exit. Now, someone's shaking their head already, like, whoa, the audacity, you know? It wasn't until those electric doors slipped open for me and I was crossing the threshold with my trolley full of watermelons that the reality of my white privilege hit me in the face. Because in my mind, the worst case scenario that I could ever imagine was that an employee would say to me, "Excuse me, ma'am, did you pay for those watermelons?" To which I would calmly pull out the receipt from my pocket and present it. And then they would wish me well in a semi-embarrassed tone, and I'd be on my way. Never in my imagination would what happened to Santina Rayo at the Mumford Road Walmart happen to me. I never feared that the police would be called. nor that I'd be tackled to the ground before my children and a bunch of onlookers. I didn't imagine that I'd sustain injuries from the ordeal, because that's never happened to me. That's never happened to anybody I know. That has, to my knowledge, never happened to anybody who even looks like me. So why would I fear it? It's not in my experience, so I don't fear it. Now, I decided to talk to some of my Black friends and family members about my watermelon experience. And I was going to ask them if they would have approached the purchase of those watermelons in the same way I did. And if not, what would they have done differently? Usually, I didn't even make it to the end of the story before my listener, just like Vanessa here, eyes wide in disbelief at my audacity and privilege, said they couldn't believe it. They'd never be so stupid as to attempt what I had successfully pulled off. Why? They knew better. You see, we as human beings, we're equal in terms of worth and value. We all bleed red, as the cliche goes, but we do not all have the same lived experiences. We're not shaped by the same factors. Many of the experiences that we white people take for granted, everyday things like shopping, walking our pets in a predominantly white neighborhood, which to us is just a neighborhood, driving our car at night, these are sources of potential anxiety for Black people. White privilege is a real thing. My question for us is, what do we do with it? How do we use it to extend that privilege, or justice, or protection, or assistance to others? Second point, we all carry biases that we're not even aware of. And how do I know this? I measured mine. Harvard University has this unconscious bias test that measures whether the participant exhibits a bias towards white people. You can Google it, and you can take it for yourself, and in fact, I recommend that you do. So I went into this test with a considerable level of arrogance. I'm the only white person in my Black African family. I've embraced my husband's language and culture. I have many intimate relationships with Black people, and in particular, Black women. I lived in a majority Black nation at the time, and happily so. The majority of my colleagues were Black, so was my church. I was often the only white person in the room. So if anybody was going to pass this test, it was going to be me. So the test is like on the computer screen, all these pictures flash up really rapidly. And you have one finger on this button and the other finger on the other button. This finger means like good or desirable. This finger means bad or undesirable. And you see the picture and you just have to react and respond really quickly. So the results came in. My report was generated. And there it was. I displayed an unconscious bias towards white people. I was completely shattered. And then I got dismissive. Obviously, there's something wrong with this test. Those smart people at Harvard figured out how to rig it. It couldn't be so. If I couldn't pass this test as a white person, it couldn't be passed. Clearly, this test was biased against white people. So I kissed my teeth and I put it out of my mind. Now, years later, I was actually working on a workshop called Unconscious Bias. So I decided to revisit the test. But this time, for some minutes prior, I just spent some time calling to mind the faces of the wonderful Black people in my life. I pictured the faces of my family and friends, and I thought about how good it was when we were together, and I took the test. And this time the test said that I displayed no bias towards white people. My arrogance was gone. This test hadn't been wrong. I really did spend the majority of my life carrying this bias against people that I genuinely loved. And it made my eyes fill up with tears. Time up, Kesa, for real? All right. Finish my story, okay. All right, I got one more point. I'm gonna skip to my last point. And my last point is simply that the easiest thing we can do as white people to address anti-Black racism in our society is to listen to Black people. I thought it was enough to say that we should listen, but my friend Deanna Mohammed, who is the African Canadian student support worker at NSCC Pictou campus, says it like this. She says, listen, 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 validate. If you're considered safe enough for your Black friend or colleague to share with you how racism has affected them personally, that's a sacred exchange. You need to suspend your judgment, your explanations, your own personal opinions, and listen and validate. Now, my best friend is, last story, and then I'm out. My best friend is a temporary foreign worker from Jamaica, and she is Black. And every year, she spends half of the year picking strawberries on a farm in a rural Nova Scotian community. And she could write a book about the examples of racism that she's experienced since coming to Nova Scotia. But one stands out, and it happened on a flight coming from Toronto to Halifax. A white woman was slated to sit next to one of the other Jamaican farm workers on the flight, but she refused to sit next to a black person. So instead, she took an empty chair next to a white person. And the seat that she occupied was supposed to be my friend's. So minutes later, my friend boards the plane and finds this white woman sitting in what was supposed to be her seat. She checked her ticket and said, "Excuse me, miss, you're sitting in my seat." The white woman kept her eyes forward, refused to move, or even acknowledge that my friend had spoken to her. So she repeated herself and got the same reaction from the woman. Now you gotta picture this. Everyone else is seated except for my friend. She didn't know what to do. All eyes are on her. The captain had just come over the loudspeaker saying, "Please take your seats." So she calls the steward over for help. She showed her ticket to the steward and said that this woman was occupying her seat. The steward's response was to say to my friend, "Do you mind changing your seat and sitting over here?" indicating the spot next to the other black farm worker. My friend said that upon being asked that, she was of two minds. Part of her was angry and wanted to stand up for her right to sit where she'd been assigned. Why should she give up her seat? But in that moment, she chose to sit next to her fellow farm worker, which is how she learned about all that had transpired before she boarded. Now, I listened to my friend's story, and it broke my heart. There's so much about that experience that's wrong. I started to tell my friend how she should have responded and what she should have done. And I failed to take the advice that I'm giving you now. I should have just listened. My friend, who's very caring and patient, said that she had a very real fear that there would be repercussions if she'd stood up for her rights on that plane. She was afraid that if she was perceived as having caused a scene, it would somehow be reported to her supervisor here in Nova Scotia or to the Ministry of Labor at home. And her opportunity to come here and work, albeit for long hours, in the hot sun for minimum wage, would be lost. And that would be devastating. She wasn't telling me about it because she wanted my advice about what she should have done. She was telling me because I was her friend and she wanted my support. How different, this is what I'm leaving you with, how different might it have been if that steward had been a real ally? What if she was aware enough to see the situation for what it was? What if she fought the fight and asked the woman to move so my friend didn't have to? What if she used her position and authority to stand up for my friend? What if she was brave enough to confront the woman's racism? It would create an uncomfortable conversation, to be sure, but hopefully the biggest discomfort would have belonged to the woman whose racism was being confronted. We have to learn to be okay with discomfort, because a white person's comfort is not more important than a black person's right to be treated fairly and with dignity. There's always going to be white people like that woman on the plane, and I don't know how to change them. But we don't all have to be like that steward. We can have eyes that see, ears that listen, and hearts that have courage to act and do what's right. And that's what I choose for myself, and it's what I hope you'll choose for yourself too. And only then will we see real change. Thanks.
Wow. The three of them, yes. Powerhouse. I don't know where to start with my questions. As a result of that, I kept changing the question I would ask. And I'm going to ask this one. And I know that all three of you provided lots of insight on how people can be better allies to people of African descent. And I'm going to start with this one. What advice would you give? Stacey just gave some advice, but in addition to Stacey's advice for Otis and for Winnie, what advice would you give others in how to speak up about anti-Black racism and other inequities they may see in the work environment? So we've talked about the school environment. All of us work within the provincial government, and I don't want us to distance ourselves from that reality. What advice would you give to others, particularly bystanders, when we see, when we hear that anti-Black racism is at work within our workplaces? How should people who are non-Black address that? What should they do? It's on.
Okay. That's an interesting question, and actually, it's a simple answer that's also quite complicated at the same time. Really, what we need to do is we just have to empower everybody to just do it. They just have to say it. The example that I was giving around the stereotype cards, when I was doing it. I've done that particular workshop with probably close to about 8,000, maybe almost 9,000 students. And when I was saying that typically what happens is I'll read the cue cards off and my group will start to laugh. That has happened in every single session that I've ever ran. In one session, though, there was a student in grade 8, and he was sitting at the back of the room, and he was quite disengaged. Didn't even want to come in. Originally, I kind of had to just do a little bit of prodding and a little bit of massaging in order to get the student in. And so he did. He came in, and he sat in the back, and he kept his hood on, and he didn't say anything throughout the entire workshop. And I got to the point where I was doing the stereotypes. And I'm reading them off, and of course, everybody starts to laugh, as I mentioned. And he was actually the only student out of all 8,000, close to 9,000 students who had the bravery to stand up in the middle of the laughter, and he actually shut the entire room down, and all he did was say, "Whoa, everybody, hey, stop. That's not funny." And instantly, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Because every single person who was in the room, teachers, support workers, students, every single person stopped. They began to get a little bit more reflective about what they were hearing. They began to think a little bit deeper about what was actually happening around them. And then what happened afterwards is that other students started to go up to them and they were like, "You know what? You were right. That wasn't funny." And I could see as the students started to leave, all the others were coming up to him and kind of giving a little pat on the back and just saying, "You were right." And that's how you do it. We have to be able to be brave enough and strong enough to confront those in the moment that it's happening. Right. The other thing that I find really tricky and kind of fascinating as well is that oftentimes when things happen, there's one administrator who I was working with, and her approach was always to discipline with dignity, which sounds great on its surface. And so if something was to happen, you pull the students aside and then you talk to them quietly in a room and you explain to them what they've said or done or how it's offensive or how it's inappropriate and why they shouldn't be saying it. And then they send the students off. But always in those circumstances, what happens is as soon as a student leaves the office when they're with their administrator or their teacher, whoever is trying to correct their behavior, they walk out and they get into the hallways and all their friends gather around and their friends will say, "Well, what did they say?" And you know what the kids say? Nothing. Right? So 2 things happen. One, that idea about disciplining with dignity, it allowed everybody else in the room not to see your disdain for that behavior. Right? The fact that you weren't able to confront it in the moment and you weren't able to call it out, even though it was done publicly, you wanted to do it privately. We have to be able to call it out in front of everybody. We have to be able to call it out and say, "You know what? That's not going to work for me right now. That's not going to be okay." And we have to be able to be strong in our convictions when we see those things happening. And it also doesn't matter the race of the person who is using those derogatory comments. Mm-hmm. The idea that somehow, if you happen to be African, Nova Scotian, or Black, that you can just use whichever language that you like, or that it's okay when you're within your peer groups, or that so long as you're only with a collection of a few friends that it's somehow okay, that actually, again, it diminishes what we are trying to do, which is to expand the idea of anti-Black racism. In order to do that, we have to make sure that every single person is aware and that they're comfortable enough to say, "That's not funny."
Thank you. Thank you.
I think it's a 2-part question, actually, because first of all, I think of my experiences and those folks who came to support me, and whether they came earnestly to support or by guilt, right? And I say that because I think I need to be honest about the relationship I have with the person who is going to speak on my behalf, right? Or speak and to support me. And so we know, persons of African descent, we know that if we're in a room and if a white person says the exact same thing that you say, that is valued differently. And so I need to be prepared when that if I'm coaching that person to say the same things that I may have said, but I also need to be prepared for my emotional response when they are validated and when I'm dismissed. And so I think we need to be honest in that relationship. I think we need to understand the risks that are involved. And I kind of equate it with if I was to rob a bank and Otis decided to come with me, and I'm inside the bank and Otis is driving the car, And Otis sees the police, and Otis runs, and I get caught. And so when we're looking at allyship, is that person going to hang around even though the police are there? Are they going to hang around and go down with me, or are they going to run? And oftentimes what happens with that level of support, people are determining their level of risk. And their level of risk is no more less important than the risk that I take every day. And so for me, I think we really need to assess that level of relationship, and we need to be mindful of the impact that it's going to have on you, because it really dismisses your ability and your own personal power and voice.
Thank you very much. So I heard call it out, and I feel that's equivalent to the real disciplining with dignity. Calling it out is what it means to discipline with dignity. Be honest, understand the risks, assess the level of relationships as you determine the level of risk. Thank you very much. Now open to the audience. Is there at least one burning question? I see a couple hands in the front. Thank you, Mahogany. And I'd like to acknowledge the Race Relations, Equity, and Inclusion team. Mahogany O'Keefe is an education officer. She is actually responsible for the beautiful publicity, promotional items that we use. The posters and flyers were all designed by her. And I'd also like to acknowledge Suzanne Kluta, who is our program and administrative coordinator with the RREI team. And thank you both for all of your help in organizing today. So.
Heart is racing right now because I'm feeling extremely uncomfortable. But as everyone is saying here, I'm going to say it. So I'm Brazilian, and when I was born from a big family, my mom has 12 siblings, and I have aunties that are white, blue eyes, and my grandmother is black, and I recently learned that my other grandmother was actually from native South American. And I've always struggled to identify my race. And when I was at school, at university, learning biology, and more specifically genetics, I learned that there is no race for human beings, for this species. And this was blind mowing to me. Because I learned that if there is no race, there is no racism at all. And this was so powerful, and I've been trying to engage as much as I can to kind of discuss more about this. And we've been discussing about concepts and how do we perceive race. And right now, I'm engaged with the Nova Scotia Environment, the Diversity Committee, and we've been discussing the concepts of race, racism, and ethnicity. So I'm eager to learn from you. Can you share some thoughts about how do you understand the concept of race and ethnicity? Are there similarities? Are there differences?
Thank you. Any panelists can go for it?
I can take a stab at it. I think ethnicity, to me, has a lot to do with culture. So if we talk about race, then in my family, we have 3 black people, 1 white person, and 2 little mixed kids. Right? Now in South Africa, in the South African context where my kids were born and brought up, people of mixed heritage are known as colored. So that's how we describe ourselves. We're 3 blacks, 1 white, and 2 colors. That's race. When it comes to ethnicity, that's different. My husband is Zulu. That's his language, that's his people group, right? My daughter is a Luba speaker from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Her main language is Swahili. So her ethnicity is different from my husband's, even though their race is the same. You see? So ethnicity, to me, has a lot to do with culture, whereas, race has a lot to do with the color of your skin. That's how we put it. But we're all South Africans and we're all Canadians, and so there's that too. So, so it's complicated.
It is, because biologically speaking, we are all the same race.
Right.
So actually, race
Could you just hold on a second so we get it on the mic, please, so everybody can hear?
Oh, sorry. No,
Thank
I'm
you.
just saying that because of my background in science, we are all the same race, genetically, biologically speaking, but race is an important social construction that was created to separate us. And I believe that we should be discussing more this. there is no need to separate us at all because we are the same race. So it's something that it's something that I believe that we should be discussing more with all of us. For example, I'm trying to do this at our diversity committee to have panels like this one to share awareness and to talk more about uncomfortable things that makes my heart races. And it's important to see that people have different thoughts, and it's okay. I think that's the beauty of the diversity.
The only thing is that if we choose to jump over the idea of race, if we choose to just adopt the idea that we're all the same, we're all one race, we lose the opportunity to celebrate what makes us different as well. So I don't see difference in race as a negative thing. I think it's something that it is a social construct, but it's still real. Like, it has meaning. It has meaning for our lives. It has value. So I feel like let's use it as something to be celebrated, something to learn about and engage with, and not see it as a negative thing that we're not actually all the same, if you know what I mean. I don't know how you feel.
So I know that Otis also mentioned the social construction of race, and I see Whitty nodding. So you want to both respond to it?
I would say that it is important for us to have this concept to think that, let's all get along, but society doesn't allow that to happen. And when we talk about racism, we're talking about the structure. My grandmother was white. Do you think anybody cares about that? Do you think anybody cares that I have 2 master's degrees? When I go out this door, I'm a black woman. And when I'm a black woman, what happens is that all of the associated stereotypic thoughts are what people see when they see me. And so we can, as much as we want, live in this world where we want to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and think that we're all going to get along. But the reality, if I don't take care of myself mentally and prepare myself every day to walk in this world and deal with the everyday racism that I'm going to experience, then I'm doing an injustice to me, right? And, in parenting my children, I needed to parent them with a race-conscious lens so that they can grow up as much as possible to be strong black women. And so what my role was as a parent was to infuse a system that buffered against, as much as I could, that buffered against systemic racism. And regardless of how infused they were, you could ask almost anybody in this room who would have had an impact on raising my children, because that is a community way that they were raised. I can tell you that even with all of that happened, in grade 2, I still remember my child wanting blonde hair, right? And those are how ingrained racism is, right? And so we can say, we're just one race, absolutely. However, people see us differently, and we need to be able to see each other for who we are and value that diversity and embrace it.
The idea that you're kind of reaching towards is the idea that there are the genetic differences between humans and that fact that there are none, essentially among races, and there isn't. The concept of race is originally derived from the fact that depending on where your ancestors lived in relation to the equator, was going to determine how dark your skin was. So if your ancestors lived really close to the equator, where it's hot, then you're going to have darker skin. And if your ancestors live further away from the equator where it's cold, then you're going to have lighter skin in order to absorb more of the sun's heat. It's actually a survival technique. That is how we survived. However, race is socially constructed, but we are social beings. And because we're social beings, and we can't negate the fact that race is a part of our lived experience. And so there are certain things, exactly like Winnie was mentioning, there are certain things that are going to come to your forefront when you see me as an individual when I walk into a room. The fact that I also have 3 degrees, a master's, bachelor's in education, and interdisciplinary degree in peace and conflict that focuses on conflict management and negotiations. None of that is seen when I walk into the room. The first thing that gets seen is the fact that I'm a black male. And so all of the stereotypes, the ideas, the concepts, the beliefs, the biases, and everything that gets attached to a black male, all of those things negate everything else that I've done. And because of that, then we have to be conscious of the fact that, yes, race does play a role in the way that we look at each other in our society. It also plays a role in how much we value each other in our society. Because we place a certain value or or a certain emphasis on particular groups of people. Darker skinned people are those who typically have always felt disenfranchised, devalued, and because of that, we have to make sure that we're recognizing the experiences of Black people, of people from different countries, of people from different ethnicities and backgrounds. All of those things have to be taken into consideration when you're expecting to, particularly when you're trying to educate, but also when we're just trying to figure out ways of kind of navigating this socially constructed world that we live in.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There was a second question. There was a second question right beside her. Okay.
I'm not sure if I know how to address this, but
Just say it.
That's right.
there's been a couple of incidents, numerous incidents, I guess, in the news where there's things that happen in society in Nova Scotia that are just so wrong. The incidents around the street checks and the ridiculous process that went on to stop that, the studies and to come to a place where we decide that which is really common sense, that you would not stop somebody randomly on the street on the basis of color. And the difficulty that we have as a society in this province to say that is wrong, I believe enables more of the racist behavior. This incident with the young woman outside of the Walmart and things like that, was it in Walmart? To be honest, I started reading and it was just such a horrible story. It was a bad day that day, and I didn't really get through it. And I wonder, as a white person, and really as a citizen of this province, what is it that you do when it is so ingrained in the politics and the justice system of the province? How do you get to a place where you can call that out? Because it baffles me when you're at a point where you're explaining common sense and people don't get it. Maybe I'm crazy. It wouldn't be the first time somebody called me that, but I don't understand, and I don't understand what to do.
So I guess what I would say is that I would say to finish reading the story and finish looking at the story. We don't have a choice. We don't even have to finish looking at the story. You know, there are times when we hear about shootings, we hear about robberies, we hear about all that, and the first thing that comes to our mind, I hope that person wasn't Black, right? So we don't have the privilege, and really it's a privilege to close the page. Right. So I would say the first thing that you would need to do is to stay aware and stay current and go back and finish looking at that story. And the other flip side to that would be to show up when there's rallies, right?
So I have to be honest, when I started reading that story, I knew that woman was Black. I didn't have to finish reading the story. I knew the woman was Black, and I thought,
so there's another layer as to why you didn't finish reading
it. Well, because I'm ashamed, I suppose, that we would continually do the wrong thing over and over and over again to someone who's just trying to live their life.
But again, recognizing that privilege, right? So recognizing those emotions and recognizing that you have the privilege to stop. We don't have the privilege to stop.
Yeah.
That's at any given time. When I go into any store, when I go up any street, I could just simply be trying to get a coffee. At any given time, I'm vulnerable to have an experience very similar. And so when you have the privilege to stop reading or to stop looking because you're embarrassed, I'm embarrassed as well, but I do not have that same level of privilege. So I think it's important to recognize that privilege and then to show up. And there's a difference in terms of showing up, right? So, you know, I remember reading this article that talked about wake, woke, and work. And so, you know, being awake simply means when your alarm goes off. So you're waking up for the morning. You're woke, which means, you know, you feel a bit fresh because now you're out of your shower. But then how are you going to show up? And that's the critical piece. If we don't show up, then we might as well stay in bed. And we don't have a choice as persons of African descent who experience racism every day. And so I would say to you is understand where your privilege takes you and to show up.
Thank you. Thank you, Winnie. We're good?
Oh,
all right, thank you.
I'm going to jump in really quickly.
Actually, do you mind if I just kind of quickly respond to her as well? So I hear two things in what you're saying, and I just want to make a distinction clear because there's two types of racism. The first one is individual racism, where a person might experience it on an individual basis. That happens if you're on sports teams and there's somebody who's calling you names or just being derogatory, things like that. And then the other, which you're actually speaking about, is that systemic piece of racism. Okay, systemic racism is the policies, the procedures that are built into the institutions in terms of how they operate and how they do things. So what would actually happen is that you can have an individual who might not be aware of all those systemic racism practices, but because they're part of that institution, then what they do is they enforce elements of systemic racism. Both types of racism, be they systemic or the individual piece, they both have elements of power that are attached with them for the people who are experiencing it, and for those who are just kind of witnessing or being bystanders. And what you do for them is, it's easier to combat individual racism on an individual basis. So for example, if I was in this room and there's somebody who was had displaying racist beliefs or ideas or ideologies, I can confront that as an individual and I can deal with that on my own. Systemic pieces of racism are much more difficult to combat because it's built into the institution. So there might be lots of people in the room who are believing that, but the powers that be who have created the system and put them into a place, they might not be there. So how do you combat systemic racism? And that is, we have to do that. It can't be an individual process. And so when you're seeing things like the individual in Walmart, or the street checks, or the stop and frisk, or the constable, all of those things, those aren't issues that simply affect the Black community. Those are issues that affect everybody in our entire community. And if that's the case, where it affects everybody in our entire community, then we need everybody in the entire community to combat those pieces of systemic racism. So it can't just be a group of African Nova Scotians out protesting and pulling up signs and screaming and trying to hear people to make sure that our voices are heard. We have to have white members as well. We have to have... And we get to the point where it's why don't we have those other voices coming to the table and sitting with us, right? We have to start thinking about why that is. And the reason for that is because if they're going to have those allies in this fight against systemic pieces of racism, then those allies are going to have to, again, expose their own vulnerabilities. They're going to have to go ahead and expose the things that they have said or done in the past. They're going to have to lay out their biases. They're going to have to let their prejudices and things be known. And they're going to have to say, listen, I don't quite understand this, or I'm having an issue with this, or I don't have quite the language to speak on this, but I'm going to need somebody to help me along that process.
I guess that's a little bit more difficult if you have to look at yourself, but you know.
Well, it is, and again, it's part of the difficulty in what we're trying to do is that we can't do it on our own.
Absolutely, thank you, because I think that's that doesn't make it right, but it gives me some understanding, because I just have like, really, is this where we are now? That's kind of what my response is, and that's not a solution. That's just a response.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much. And I think what's very important as well is for each one of us to take that first step, you can only control yourself. So you take that first step, and maybe you're the one that joins the next protest. And you're the next one, you hear something in your workplace, to speak up about it. And you set the example as well so that others can follow.
Thank you so much. It's been a great session so far, and the information that we've received. I'm curious if each of you could speak to us a bit about, in terms of the anti-Black racism, trauma, and resilience of microaggressions in the workplace and with our colleagues. Because the examples you've used so far are pretty transparent, easy to point at and black and white and say that's unacceptable. From my own lived experience, it's a bit more complicated than that. And often another racialized person, I don't need to finish the sentence, and they're like, oh yeah, but Caucasians will but me all the way through the story. So I'm curious about what you have to share with racialized people and with our white colleagues around microaggressions in the context of this conversation.
Thank you, Louise.
Start by defining what microaggression is. Maybe not everybody's aware of what that term means. Excuse me. No, go ahead.
No.
I'm going to be the last person to speak about this. That's right.
So let me give you an example. So when we talk about microaggressions, we're talking about those very subtle types of racist comments or actions. And so, I mean, it could be as simple as, It could be as simple as having your hair braided, and someone says, "Oh, can I touch your hair?" Or not even asking, not even asking.
Right.
I remember me and my partner were at an event, and a woman came behind me and said, and my hair wasn't braided, said, "Oh, I just love your hair." And I said, "Thank you for not touching." Because she was like right there, right? And so those things happen at work as well. But also, depending on, when you're in meetings, when you're not valued, or you make a comment in a meeting, or you walk in the room and then it gets quiet. Like, it's those kinds of things where all of a sudden you feel that your presence is intimidating of others. And so, again, when I talk about the experiences of African Nova Scotia staff at the Department of Community Services, I came forward and talked about their concerns, and not just what they've experienced, the types of microaggressions, but flat-out racism and what they witnessed for African Nova Scotian families that we were working with at the time. I think for us it was really valuable to be valued, right? I mean, that we were validated in terms of our concerns. We had an opportunity and still have opportunities to come together to talk about those experiences of racism. I know that as a coping mechanism, before we sort of raised our voice fully, there's one colleague, and she and I would just call each other all the time, and just to reach out. And even if she wasn't there or if I wasn't there, we would just leave a message on the voicemail, and just to say, "Look, just having a rough day today, just needed to reach out." And whether she was there or not, I knew that she was there, and then we would just connect later. And it takes a lot for staff, because when we talk about risk, it takes a lot for staff to come forward and raise those issues, because, again, they don't want to be labeled. They need their job. They don't want to be passed over for promotions. They don't want to be perceived as a troublemaker. And so, those spaces really need to be safe in order for folks to move forward and to come out.
Microaggressions are really a tricky thing to have to deal with, because with microaggressions, the way that it works is that often the others in the room aren't necessarily going to recognize or even notice when they happen. But for the person who's experienced it, it's almost like having a fever. Like, when it's there, and even though others might not be able to see it, you can feel it, you're experiencing it, and this is what your reality is. Again, because of the way that microaggressions work in that kind of subtle, nuanced way, it's having the conversations around microaggressions often get very muddy, because as soon as you will confront somebody and say, what you said or kind of implied to, then you're faced with a lot of excuses. "Oh, I didn't really mean that. What I was actually trying to say was," and "Oh, I didn't mean you. I was talking about those," all the other excuses start to roll out. And so, again, the conversation that you're going to have around microaggressions can be very tricky. But I lean on my initial point, where we just have to be able to go out and say it. And when you speak it, what you'll notice is that there are often or not other people in the room who feel the same way that you do, who thought that there may have been something there, but didn't have the words in order to articulate exactly what you were feeling. So giving the others a voice around you, as well as giving yourself a voice to confront microaggressions, is difficult. I certainly understand that, but it is also one of the most important things that you can do, because often the microaggressions go unnoticed, and they also go unchecked.
And as white people, they do go unnoticed by us because we're often not in that space.
Right.
And for me, it took like an immersive experience of living with people of color over a long time before I would even notice them.
Right.
It's little things like, I'm out to eat with my husband, and the waitress comes with a bill, and she gives it to me. And I'm like, "Why are you bringing me the bill? He's going to pay." What's that about? Little things. So as white people, I think we need to try and tune ourselves in to what's going on around us. That happens best in the context of relationship. And then it goes back to listen. Listen. When someone tells you why they're annoyed that you tried to touch their hair, don't get salty about it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, like listen, validate is so important. When your colleague comes back and says they're upset because at lunchtime they were in a store and someone was following them, don't be like, are you sure that's what was going on? Maybe they were just doing their job, or maybe that person was just having a bad day. Like, don't make excuses. Just listen and then validate.
Thank you, Louise. No. Are you good? So our time, we're going to take one more. Okay. Final question, yes.
I'm just a little hesitant to reduce the conversation to the microaggressions because I'll describe an incident that happened to me on my birthday in 2018. A coworker who I respect as a coworker and deal with on a daily basis and have to collaborate with them and work together and do all that stuff. But I'm not a person who, if I don't like you or we don't get along, I sense something about you. You don't know it, but you know I don't really like you. But we're going to get along because we work in the same place. I sense something in you. You've said some things that made the hair on the back of my neck go up. On my birthday in 2018, this person left on my desk with a note saying happy birthday, who had just come back from someplace in Cuba or whatever, a little doll with a black face, bulging eyes, and big red lips, and a bandana tied on her head. On the one hand, it validated everything that I was thinking, that I knew now what made the hair on the back of my head go up. And I'm Buddy Day's daughter. I'm more Buddy Day, the fighter at the gym, than Buddy Day, the freedom fighter. My first instinct, I'm not joking here. I'm telling you something that happened to me. I'm telling you this happened to me in 2018, not in the olden days. It has happened all over my career, mind you. I'm on my way out the door. But in 2018, this happened to me. So instead of going, like I have done all through my career, and reporting it to my supervisors to have nothing happen, my instinct was to go whip her behind, but I didn't. I did what I always do and go and report it to my supervisors, who have no idea why I would be offended by that, but okay, I guess if you're offended, and I don't know what ever happened with that incident. I know to this day, you see me here with a mic in my hand shaking about it because it affected me, it traumatized me. In 2018, I think we have to sit and talk about this trauma that I'm on the way out of the workforce and I'm still feeling from incidents that have happened all the way through my work experience in this government. So it's painful and it's real and it's not funny. And there's still nothing being done about it because that person moved on to a higher the way to get rid of her, the lazy one in the workplace, is to promote her to another position. And that's what happened with her. So as far as I'm concerned, when I'm the black woman in the office, when I see how you handle a racist incident in 2018, is to promote that person and move them on. I've seen it happen my whole career, but anyway, I just wanted to get that out there that, you know, I don't want the impression to come out of this day for you all to leave out of here and think we're just dealing with little incidents of people hurting someone's feelings. It's trauma.
Yes.
It's trauma that we live with on a daily basis. And that's what you need to know.
In our workforce. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think that it's important to recognize that we, as people of African descent, survive in a racist society. We do not do that kind of work that we need to do for ourselves. And so whether it's in the workplace, compounded by in the store, compounded by the nightmares that you have at night because you're still internally dealing with the situation, like that's the work that we need to do as people of African descent. The purpose of wanting to show that film, because I think white people need to know that we do have it bad. And we need to know that we do have it bad, and we need to be able to do something about it.
Thank you. Go ahead, Otis.
Go ahead.
I just had a question. In our department where we're at right now, we're seeing a lot of what you mentioned, that nothing's being done when people are bringing these kind of incidences to the attention of supervisors, whether microaggressions are just whether microaggressions are just straight up aggressive racism. And I'm new to my department, and I've seen it already multiple times where there's no consequences, there's no reaction from supervisors. So where, and maybe this is just a technical question, but where do we go from our supervisors? Where can I go above to get some kind of response? Like there's nothing happening.
Well, you can come to the Human Rights Commission.
Okay. That would be the next.
And we can talk afterwards if you need some additional information on how to report.
That would be
great. But we do need accountability. The minister spoke about accountability for senior leaders, and we need to see that in a real way. We don't need to hear about accountability. We need to define accountability. We need to see it in action. We need to feel it in the same way that we feel the trauma. We need to feel the accountability.
Right, okay.
At all times. Yeah. So I'm going to ask a question to tie up. I have many questions here, but we wanted to open the floor for you. I wanted us to talk about white fragility, which is an issue where, we talk about race, we talk about our trauma, and white people get triggered with anger, fear, guilt, become argumentative, silent, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to talk about the White Lives Matter movement in the face of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we know that that's a reality in our society in terms of signage even being placed around Spring Garden Road, other parts of this province, around the country, rallies being held in the US and in Canada. But our own response to that internally within the provincial government, which is when there are designated positions posted and there are efforts towards employment equity, we have our own response, which I see as the White Lives Matter movement within. I wanted to talk about that, but I can't, but I'm starting it so you can talk about it when you get back to work. So lots of things that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the fact that the resilience of people of African descent is oftentimes misconstrued to make others who are not of African descent feel that we're so strong we can take it. Or, everything's fine, because we're not all the time breaking down and crying. Sometimes that can be misconstrued that they're okay. We don't need to focus our attentions on anti-Black racism because it's not really a big problem. And that is a problem within the provincial government, and we do, thank you for sharing your story, we do need to address it. We need to be aware of it, and we need to understand and validate the trauma. We need to validate the experiences. We need to have open ears, listen, 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 and then we need to act on it, because that's what accountability means, action. But for a final thought for our panelists, what does a workplace that has a zero tolerance for anti-Black racism look like? Now, we only have a few minutes, so I'm sorry at 11 a.m. to toss that out to you.
I would say that it looked like work in progress. That's as far as I can go, because when we talk about a zero tolerance, really, what does that mean? And we strive for that. But I think, when our guest talked about the experience that she had, and the other individual spoke about where do we go, I think we still need to find those pathways in terms of how do we get to a zero tolerance, and really what does zero tolerance mean. I think when you talked about, white fragility, who are those folks who are in those supervisory management positions? What is their understanding of what our experience is? When we are traumatized, we are seen not as being resilient, but we're seen as too sensitive. or that, all of those kinds of things, which further impacts the psychological impact of racism. And so we strive to have a zero tolerance. I think there needs to be, in order for that to be successful and not to continue to be a work in progress, I think we need to have a stronger understanding of what racism is.
Thank you, Winnie.
I would say that workplace would have a culture of learning. And I say culture of learning because the reality is that if we're talking about a specific work environment or government building or schools or wherever it is, the reality is that our society, broader sense, the world that we live in, is racist. There's a lot of images, there's a lot of messages, there are a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of mess around race. And in order to create a place where there's zero tolerance, that means that there first has to be an acknowledgement of the fact that racism exists. Then you have to have an understanding amongst the staff and the folks who make up that environment or that building that not everybody is going to know what they're supposed to know. Everybody comes with their own lived experiences. We all have our own cultural backgrounds. We all come from different corners and different places. Some of those places have actually informed our racist beliefs and actions. But when we come into a workplace, if we come with an idea that, you know what, there are things that I don't understand, there's things that I don't know, but I'm willing to learn, then you can move towards a culture of an anti-racist, anti-black racist environment, because then folks will be willing to say, you know what, I didn't say that right. And I am sorry for what I've said. Or the microaggressions that I put before you on the table, you know what, I understand that now, and I apologize for that. And then the macroaggressions that I put on your desk, you know what, those are going to be dealt with, because it's not just the one individual who's come forward, but actually our entire staff came forward and said, you know what, this wasn't okay that this happened to one of our staff members, one of our colleagues, somebody that we work closely with every day. It wasn't okay for her, but it's also not okay for me or for him or for anybody else in the building. That's what I mean by a culture of learning. When people can actually come together and that they understand that there's things that they don't understand, and that they're willing to work through it, and they're willing to ask questions, they're willing to be confronted, and they're willing to learn.
And for that, you need safe spaces, right? Absolutely. For that, you need opportunities like we're having today to be rolled out in your own places of work and in your own departments. And just to build on what you say, because I completely agree, real change happens often, I believe, in the context of relationships. And if I'm only seeing you at work, right? Like, I don't have a complete picture of what your life is like. Even if you make attempts to educate me, and even if, we have these great workshops, I still don't really get it. I still don't really see what you go through on a daily basis. So the importance of having the courage as white people to reach out, to cross lines that our society has drawn around us to separate us. Doing that in the context of real relationship, I think, helps us to see people as holistic human beings. And, you can't hear a story about the kid that was assaulted by the cops in Bedford. You can't hear that story and think, oh, well, what did he do? When you're picturing your own friend's son, in that situation, it becomes personal in a way that, it needs to be personal. So that happens in the context of relationship. We need to have the courage to reach across those lines.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our fabulous panel today. Thank you, Kesa. And while we're waiting for that zero tolerance environment, I would encourage everybody to create safe spaces for yourself. I know kind of within the African Canadian Women's Network, for example, call a friend, call a buddy. Before you explode on someone, make sure you manage your own self-care, because it is critical. Because for people of color, African Nova Scotians, it is hard in the workforce. It is hard because you can go to a meeting and not be validated, and how do you kind of continue on in the day? And for me, for example, I could have 5-6 meetings in a day, and if the first one starts off being invalidating, then how do you muster up the strength to continue on with that day? So get a friend, call a buddy, just find a way to manage self-care, because it is so traumatic, you need to make sure you preserve your mental health. So I would encourage you to do that.
So on behalf of African Nova Scotian Affairs and the Human Rights Commission, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I know I'm actually kind of standing here just jumping because I see some of my CCH colleagues here, and I know we're going to have a conversation after the conversation. So I would encourage you to continue to have these conversations because it matters. And as Minister Ince said earlier, just say it. Just say it. Like, have safe spaces to have these conversations. Say it and really listen, and validate. So thank you for that. I know I'm trying to rush because I know it's 11:06 we're after, and, Oh, we have door prize. Oh, yes, right. So one of the things I just wanted to, we hope that you would have been able to get from the conversation today to engage in self-reflection and self-awareness about your own actions, about your own behaviors, and awareness to really kind of build that courage to help address systemic issues that negatively impact people of African descent. So before I conclude today, there's a few people that I just want to thank, building on the African proverb, it takes many hands make light work. So it's not just Kesa and I doing all this. She did mention Mahogany and Suzanne. And again, Mahogany is so exceptionally talented, who designed, is she behind me? Yes, who designed, I'm looking for her, who designed all of the stuff. And if you look at the, Winnie, can you just hold it up for a second? If you look at the flyer, the agenda, it is just so powerful, right? So hopefully you get that, take it home, pin it up on your desk to continue to have those conversations. So the staff at the Delmore Buddy Day Learning Institute for sharing this incredible space. Jeff Overmars at the Human Rights Commission, Francine Camo at African Nova Scotian Affairs, and of course Amelia Jarvis and the CNS folks who are back here making sure that we can preserve this recording so that we can actually maybe take it to your departments, take it to your diversity committees to continue the dialogue and the conversation. And so now we have a couple of door prizes, but I do have tokens of appreciation for our speakers, and we will give them to them. But one of the things I just want to end on is continue the conversation. I can't say that enough because nothing is ever going to change if we don't have dialogue about it. Yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, so I appreciate when you said that you're sitting there feeling uncomfortable, because if you come into a space and you're comfortable, you're not really learning anything. And because you're uncomfortable, you're trying to rationalize in your head, okay, what am I feeling? What do I know from what I'm hearing? And what do I know from to be true? And how is that going to change as I move forward? So thank you for sharing that. And I hope that everybody here is feeling a little uncomfortable so that when you leave here, things are going to be different. You're going to have conversations. And again, yeah, I just want to leave on that. You cannot say it enough. Continue the conversation. So thank you. Oh, yes. One of the things we have in our gift bags is the book by Mayanne Francis, her memoirs. And I tell you, if you did not download it free for African Heritage Month, there was a free download. If you don't have a chance to pick that up, I would pick it up because she talks about some of the issues that she faced when she was in Government House. And you talk about systems of anti-Black racism. That was a system that she had to not overcome, but she had to work within. And we were really fortunate in that she was able to sign the books for our panelists. So they're actually in your bags that she signed for you. She said she wasn't able to be here, but she will be at the event, hopefully, on the 21st of March. So yeah, so that's in your bags. And so now we just have some door prizes. Did everybody have a ticket? No. Ooh. Okay. Raise your hand if you don't have a ticket. We have the other stubs back here, that's all. I did, but I'll mention it again. So while everybody's getting their ticket, if you want to continue the conversation at another venue, as I mentioned before, the National Black Canadian Summit is coming up on March 21st. Well, during the 20th to the... Is it sold out? It's sold out. No, not our event. Our event wouldn't be sold out. Not your event, no, but the summit itself. Okay, so on March 21st, the evening, the tag team of Kesa and I are doing another event in partnership with the Michael Jean Foundation and the Nova Scotia Mass Choir. We're doing an event to have another conversation similar to here. It's around anti-Black racism, what is it and why should I care? So I know everybody's probably saying, oh, that sounds interesting. You can go. It's, so it's free for the public. It's at the Nova Center at 6:30. Is there an RSVP? Or?
Yes, and there are flyers on the table.
There's flyers out at the table. Please pick one up and just send your RSVP in. We're good? Everybody get a ticket now? Okay. And the winning number is, you did see Mahogany shake it up behind me. So it's 0891099. Is that 9? Yay. Yeah. And the other one is 0891043. Oh. So that concludes today. Thank you, everybody. That concludes it. Thank you very much. So those who are here, there are some light refreshments there if you want to grab something before you leave. And those tuning in online, thank you very much.